The blizzard was so loud that night that you couldn't hear yourself think. The wind came off the mountains like something alive, like something that had been patient for a very long time and had finally decided it was done being patient, and it hit Coldwater Creek, Montana with the kind of force that makes you understand, very quickly and very permanently, that the world does not actually care whether you survive the night. It simply proceeds, whether you are in it or not. Ethan Cole had been in that cabin for 4 days. 4 days of the silence he had come here specifically to find. 4 days of no orders, no missions, no weight of anyone else's survival pressing down on him. He was 43 years old, and he had earned that silence in ways that don't appear on any document. He almost didn't hear it. Almost. It came through the storm somewhere around 2 in the morning. Not loud. Not dramatic. The kind of sound that gets lost inside a bigger sound the way a single voice gets lost inside a crowd. Something small. Something at the very bottom of the range of sounds a living creature makes. Atlas heard it first. That massive white German shepherd, who had been asleep on the rug by the wood stove, lifted his head. And the quality of attention that came over him in that moment was not the drowsy curiosity of a dog who heard something interesting. It was the other thing. The thing Ethan had seen in him 3 times before. The kind that meant something was wrong in a way that hadn't revealed itself yet. Every single time Atlas had looked like that, someone had been in danger. Ethan put on his boots. What he found in the blizzard that night, padlocked, dark, frozen, would break something open in him that he hadn't known was still capable of being broken. 7 dogs. Left behind. In January. In Montana. With a padlock on the door that said as clearly as any words could say it, "You are not worth the effort of saving." 6 of them were on the floor. 1 was still standing. He had been standing over the others for 4 days. Stay with me. Because what Atlas did that night, and what that dog with the torn ear had been doing alone in the dark, and what the man who ordered that padlock was not expecting, all of it is coming. And it will stay with you long after this ends. There is a kind of quiet that only exists in mountain towns in deep winter, and if you have never experienced it, I want you to understand that it is nothing like any quiet you already know. It is not the quiet of an empty room or a late library or the pause between songs. It is the quiet of something enormous holding its breath. 10,000 acres of snow-covered timber absorbing every sound before it can travel, swallowing footsteps and voices and the distant noise of the world with the patient efficiency of something that has been doing this for centuries and finds nothing remarkable about it. Coldwater Creek, Montana sat inside that quiet the way a stone sits at the bottom of a still pond, completely, and without any desire to be anywhere else. The town had 431 residents, according to the sign at the edge of the main road, though anyone who had lived there more than a season would tell you the sign was optimistic. People left Coldwater Creek the way people leave places that offer more beauty than opportunity. Gradually, regretfully, with a private conviction that they would return someday, a conviction most of them carried all the way to wherever they ended up without ever acting on it. What remained was a community that had learned to do more with less, that had developed the particular self-sufficiency of people who understand that the nearest hospital is 45 minutes away on a good road, and considerably longer when January ice has done what January ice does to mountain pavement. They were not hard people. They were honest people, which is different, and the distinction mattered in a place like this. Into this town, on the second Tuesday of January, came a dark green pickup truck rolling down off the mountain highway with road ice crunching under its tires and a massive white German shepherd in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the 2-inch gap of open window, drinking in the cold air with the focused intensity of an animal cataloging an environment he had never encountered before. The truck carried enough gear in its bed to suggest serious intention. Supply crates, equipment, enough rope to suggest either serious outdoor purpose or the beginning of something the people of Coldwater Creek would discuss at the diner for weeks. Which, as it turned out, they did. Ethan Cole was 43 years old, and he looked it in the specific way that men look their age when the years have been earned rather than simply accumulated. Nothing soft about him. Not in a threatening way. Not in the way of someone who wants you to know he is hard, but in the way of a man whose body has been a working instrument for so long it has stopped carrying anything that doesn't serve a function. Medium height, solid athletic build. Short dark brown hair, kept practical. Light gray eyes that processed more information per second than average without any visible effort, the way a good instrument takes in a scene. There was a faint scar along his right cheek, old enough to have become simply one of his features, the way all the important things eventually settle into a person and stop announcing themselves. He wore a dark navy work jacket over heavy wool, thick canvas pants, serious boots. Nothing about his appearance announced who he was or what he had done, because Ethan Cole was not the kind of man who needed his clothing to speak for him. 16 years in the Navy. 12 as a SEAL. He had left the service 14 months earlier with a medical discharge he described to the few people he discussed it with as a back injury, which was true but incomplete the way describing a hurricane as windy is true but incomplete. The full account involved a vehicle and a road and a moment in a country he was not permitted to name, and it had rearranged several things inside him that the doctors could identify on their imaging equipment and several others that no equipment reaches. He had done the rehabilitation. He had done the counseling. He had done everything the system asked of him with the same focused discipline he brought to everything else, and when it was finished he had stood in a parking lot in Nashville on a gray Thursday afternoon and understood with complete clarity that what he needed was not available in any city. He needed the kind of space that pushed back. The kind that didn't care about his rank or his record or how many operations he'd survived. The kind that simply sat there, enormous and indifferent, and waited to see what he was made of. He had found the cabin listing at 1 a.m, Atlas asleep at his feet, the familiar restlessness moving through him that had been visiting at odd hours for months. Coldwater Creek, Montana. Remote mountain property. Existing structure. Minimum bid $800. He had looked at the listing for a long time. Then he had looked at Atlas, who raised his head from the floor and regarded him with those deep golden amber eyes in the way the dog had of looking when something was being decided. Ethan placed the bid. He won the following morning. 3 weeks later he loaded the truck and drove north and west and up, into the mountains, toward the silence. Atlas had been with him for 6 years. The dog was 91 pounds of muscle and intelligence wrapped in a coat so densely white it sometimes seemed to generate its own light. Thick, weatherproof, built for genuine winter. His eyes were deep golden amber, warm in a way you didn't always expect from an animal of his size, the kind of eyes that could be entirely soft when softness was needed and entirely focused when focus was required, and the transition between those two states happened in under a second when circumstances demanded. One of his ears carried a small notch at the tip, an old injury from a training exercise, years before Ethan had known him, that gave him a slightly asymmetrical look Ethan had always found distinguished. Atlas had been paired with Ethan during his final deployment, and the bond that formed between them in that environment, the kind of bond that develops between creatures who have been in genuinely dangerous places together and have learned, through repeated testing, that the other one will not fail when failure would be fatal, was not the kind that transfers easily into words. It simply existed, as fundamental as the mountains themselves. The cabin sat on a north-facing slope 3 miles above the main road, accessible by a gravel track that became increasingly theoretical as the elevation increased. Solid where it mattered, foundation sound, roof intact, the old propane system functional after the new connections Ethan had arranged. The wood stove in the main room was cast iron, decades old, seasoned by more winters than Ethan could calculate, and it threw heat with a generosity that made the small interior feel genuinely warm within an hour. That first evening, sitting before it with his coffee and Atlas stretched on the braided rug he had brought from Nashville, Ethan felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Not peace, not yet. The beginning of something. A stillness in him that was not numbness. A quiet that felt earned. He spent the first 3 days doing what needed doing, stacking firewood, testing the well pump, organizing supplies, learning the rhythms of the cabin and the clearing. Atlas was with him through all of it, ranging ahead on the morning walks around the property, returning at intervals with the systematic attentiveness of a working dog who has never fully switched that function off and probably never will. The mountain was beautiful the way genuinely wild places are beautiful, not arranged for observation, not performing itself for anyone, simply present and enormous, and entirely indifferent to whether you found it beautiful or terrifying. Ethan found it both simultaneously, which felt exactly right. On the fourth day the blizzard arrived. Not gradually. This was not the kind of storm that builds slowly and gives you time to prepare. This was a system that had been organizing itself over the Canadian border for days and arrived at Coldwater Creek fully formed and entirely committed, dropping out of the sky at 11 in the evening with the sudden totality of a door being slammed from the other side. The wind hit the cabin all at once, a single enormous pressure against every wall simultaneously, sending a sound through the structure that was less like weather and more like an argument. Then the snow, horizontal and dense, reducing visibility from the window to the length of Ethan's arm and then to less, until the world outside was simply white noise made physical. Ethan was ready. He had checked the weather radio that afternoon, brought in additional wood, confirmed the generator, reviewed the supplies. He banked the wood stove, verified Atlas had eaten, and went to bed at 10:30 with the storm pressing its full argument against the cabin, and the cabin receiving it with the competence of a structure that had been through this before. He was asleep by 11. He was awake at 2:14. Not because of anything he had heard, not initially. He surfaced from sleep the way he always did in uncertain environments, quickly and completely, from nothing to full alertness in the space of a breath. He lay still, identifying sounds. The storm. The wood stove settling. The particular creak of the north wall under sustained wind. Normal. Expected. Then he looked at Atlas. Atlas was not on the rug. He was standing at the north wall, all 4 feet planted, his great white head turned toward the wall as though the wall itself were a window he could see through. The quality of attention he projected was not the alert watchfulness of a dog monitoring his environment. It was the other thing. The thing Ethan had seen in him 3 times before, in 3 different countries, and that had preceded, on each occasion, something requiring immediate and serious action. Ethan did not ask questions. He put on his thermal layers, his heavy jacket, his gloves, his boots. He took the large flashlight from beside the door. He looked at Atlas, who was already waiting. He opened the door. The cold hit him immediately and completely, a physical presence that occupied the space between his layers and his skin within 15 seconds and communicated in the clearest possible language that every second out here was a negotiation. The wind drove snow sideways, and the flashlight beam died approximately 10 feet out, giving him a cone of illuminated nothing more disorienting than darkness. He found Atlas's collar, not to restrain him, but to maintain contact between them as they moved into the white. Atlas led him north. Not hesitantly, not searching, north, in a straight line, with the purposeful directness of an animal who knows exactly where he is going because he has already been gathering this information while the human beside him was asleep. Ethan followed. He kept his body angled into the wind, placing his feet carefully in snow that had gone above his boots, counting his steps automatically, maintaining orientation by feel and by the white shape moving ahead of him through the storm. 200 yards north of the cabin, Atlas slowed. Then stopped. They were at the edge of a property line, an old post and wire fence mostly buried now, only the post tops visible. Beyond it, 50 yards further into the tree line, was a long low building Ethan had noticed on his property survey but not investigated. He had assumed it was agricultural storage. He had not gone to look because it was not his business and he had enough of his own. He went to look now. The building had no south-facing windows. A single door at the east end, padlocked with a heavy commercial lock chosen not for the value of what it protected but for the message it sent about access. No light. No sound. In the flashlight beam the structure looked closed and cold and completely still. Atlas was at the east wall, pressing his nose to the gap between the timber courses, breathing deliberately, reading the air with the focused intensity of a dog extracting every molecule of available information. Then, in the brief interval between one gust and the next, when the blizzard's roar dropped by 1 degree, Ethan heard it. Small. At the very bottom of the range of sounds a living thing makes. A whimper, or something adjacent to one. The sound of something that had been making larger sounds for a long time and had run out of the energy for them and was now down to whatever smallest version this was. He took the bolt cutters from his equipment bag. He had brought the bag without consciously deciding to, the way training makes certain reaches automatic, and removed the padlock in 12 seconds. He opened the door. The smell hit him before the light found anything. Cold and animal, and the particular weight of a closed space with living creatures inside it for days. Not the smell of death, but the smell of something that had been moving in that direction, and had not arrived, only because something inside it refused to allow it. He moved the flashlight. 7 dogs. In individual kennel runs separated by chain link. Huddled together in the 2 runs on the east side where the wind was blocked on 2 faces, where the combined body heat of 7 animals had created a microclimate that was still deeply, seriously cold, but was the difference between where they were and where they would have been if they had scattered. 6 were on the floor. 1 was standing. A large dog, Belgian Malinois build, a working dog's proportions. His coat was dirty and matted, and he had clearly not eaten in as long as the others. 1 ear had an old injury at the tip. A notch. The same asymmetry that Atlas carried. He was standing between the 6 dogs on the floor and the door Ethan had just opened. Not growling. Not showing aggression. Simply standing there, positioned between the others and whatever might come through that door, with the patient and absolute commitment of something that has made a decision and is not reconsidering it regardless of what arrives. He was shaking, the deep involuntary shaking of a body that had been running its thermoregulation at maximum for days and was now running on reserves it did not have. But he was standing. He had been standing over them for 4 days. Atlas came through the door and stopped. The 2 dogs looked at each other across the cold interior, the massive white shepherd from outside and the exhausted standing dog from inside, and something passed between them that Ethan could not name but could feel the way you feel certain things that exist below the threshold of language. Not aggression. Not challenge. Something closer to recognition. Ethan Cole sat down on the frozen concrete floor. Not because he needed to rest. Because some situations require you to come down to their level before you can address them. And because the dog who was still standing, still between the others and the door, doing the only job he understood, that dog deserved to be met at his own level by the person who had finally come. He sat on the frozen floor with the flashlight in his lap and looked at the standing dog, and the dog looked back at him with eyes that were exhausted and alert simultaneously, and Ethan said quietly, "You're all right now. I've got you. All of you. You can stop." The dog did not stop. But his shaking changed quality. The shaking of a body that has been told help is here is different from the shaking of a body that believes it is alone. Both shake. But the sound of them is not the same, if you know how to listen. Ethan stood up. And he went to work. The morning came in the way January mornings come in mountain country. Not with any particular announcement, not with the gradual warming that mornings in other places bring, but with simply a different quality of darkness, a lightening that was less about light and more about the darkness becoming less absolute, the shapes of things reasserting themselves against the gray in slow increments, until eventually you could call it day even if it bore little resemblance to what people in warmer places meant by the word. Ethan had been awake for most of it. He had slept in the chair for perhaps 2 hours in the deep middle of the night, and he had woken to find Atlas pressed against his left leg and Soldier still by the door, still on his side now rather than standing, which was progress in a direction that mattered, and the 5 others distributed across the cabin floor in various configurations of recovery that were close enough to ordinary sleep that Ethan allowed himself to feel something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. He made coffee. He checked on each of the 7 dogs in the methodical order he had established the night before, starting with the 2 who had been most critical and working outward. The 2 critical ones, a female shepherd mix whose name he did not yet know and a young male of indeterminate breed who had been the smallest and the coldest when Ethan had found them, were both breathing steadily, both responsive to touch, both in the slow upward movement of bodies that have been given what they needed and are using it. The serious 3 were eating, tentatively, from the shallow dishes Ethan had refilled at 4 in the morning. The small movements of recovery, a tail that had not moved the night before moving now, a head lifting toward the food dish rather than away from it, were the kind of movements that you notice when you have learned to read the difference between stillness that means rest and stillness that means something worse, and Ethan noticed every one of them and filed each one in the part of him that was running the continuous assessment. Soldier 8. Not enthusiastically, not in the way of a dog who has forgotten what hunger is and is rediscovering it with pleasure. Deliberately, carefully, in the way of an animal that understands that the eating matters and is doing it as a function rather than a pleasure, because functions are what he knows. He looked at Ethan while he ate. Ethan looked back. This had been their primary mode of communication for the past several hours, a continuous low-level exchange of information conducted entirely through sustained eye contact, which Ethan found more communicatively efficient than most conversations he had with people. At 8 in the morning he called Maggie Holt. She answered on the first ring, which told him she had not slept either, which he had expected. He told her the 7 were stable. He told her the 2 critical ones had moved to Sirius overnight, which was the right direction. He told her Soldier had eaten. He heard something on the other end of the line that was not quite a sound and was not quite silence, something in between, the sound of a person receiving information that matters enormously and not yet trusting themselves to speak around it. Then he asked her about Victor Crane. She told him what she knew, which was more than he had expected and less than he needed. Crane had been in the county position for 11 years. He had a reputation, she said carefully, for finding administrative solutions to problems that other people in his position would have addressed differently. There had been 2 other facility closures that she knew of in the past 4 years, both smaller operations, both involving the same pattern: short notice, denied extensions, the phrase county will handle. She did not know what had happened to the animals in those cases. She had not asked at the time, which she said in the tone of someone who has spent recent days adding that fact to a list of things she wished she had done differently. Ethan thanked her. He told her he was going to look into it. He said it in the tone that people who have known him for more than a few hours recognize as the tone that means he is going to do what he says he is going to do, completely and without the shortcuts that produce incomplete outcomes. He was going to do exactly that. He spent the morning on the satellite phone and the laptop he had brought from Nashville, working through the publicly available county records with the systematic attention of someone trained to extract patterns from large amounts of information quickly and accurately. Property records. Facility registration documents. The administrative orders for the 3 kennel closures, all of which were on file with the county and all of which bore Crane's name on the signature line. The timeline of each closure. The follow-up documentation, or in 2 of the 3 cases, the absence of follow-up documentation, which in an administrative context is itself a kind of documentation, the documentation of something that someone decided not to write down. What he found in the property records was the thing that made the shape of it clear. The land on which Coldwater Mountain Kennel sat, Maggie's land, the 22 acres she had operated the facility on for more than 2 decades, had been the subject of a purchase inquiry 14 months earlier. The inquiry had come from a land development company based in Billings. The inquiry had been declined by Maggie, who had documented the conversation in a brief note in the facility's administrative file that she had shared with Ethan when he had asked to see anything related to the property's recent history. The land development company, Ethan found with 30 minutes of research, had as one of its listed principal investors a name he had already encountered that morning. Victor Crane was listed not under his own name but under the name of a holding company, 2 removes from direct visibility, the kind of distance that is not accidental and is not difficult to establish for someone who works in county property services and understands how these documents are filed and where they are reviewed. He sat back from the laptop and looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a moment, the way he looked at ceilings when he was organizing information into its clearest possible structure. Then he looked at Soldier, who was watching him from across the room with the attentive patience of a dog who has learned to read the quality of a person's thinking from the quality of their stillness. There it was. Not a complicated scheme. In Ethan's experience, the most damaging things rarely were. A county official with a financial interest in a piece of property, using his administrative authority to manufacture a compliance violation, issuing a closure order with a timeline designed to be impossible to meet, denying the extension that would have given the animals a chance, allowing the phrase county will handle to do the work of making the situation sound managed when it was in fact being abandoned, and walking away from the padlocked door with 22 acres of potentially valuable mountain land one step closer to the outcome he had been working toward for more than a year. The 7 dogs had simply been inconvenient. Not malicious, exactly. Not the point. Just a complication in the math that Crane had decided was acceptable to round down to 0. Ethan Cole had a particular response to that category of decision. He drove down to town at 11 o'clock with Atlas in the passenger seat and a folder of printed documents on the seat behind him. He went first to the county sheriff's office, which occupied a modest building on the east end of the main street and which was staffed, on that particular Thursday morning, by a deputy named Sarah Mills who was 34 years old with red hair in a tight braid and sharp hazel eyes and the specific manner of someone who is competent at her job and knows it without needing to perform the knowing. She was not immediately receptive. This was not a surprise. Ethan had walked into enough law enforcement offices in enough jurisdictions to understand that the initial presentation of outside information is almost always received with a combination of professional skepticism and territorial caution, and that the appropriate response is not to push harder but to lay out what you have as clearly and completely as possible and allow the quality of the information to do the work. He did that. He sat across the desk from Deputy Mills and he presented what he had found: the property inquiry, the holding company, the Crane connection, the pattern across 3 facility closures, the timeline, in the same methodical order in which he had organized it, without editorializing, without urgency he didn't feel, without the kind of emotional framing that invites dismissal. She listened. She made notes. She asked 2 questions that told him she was actually processing what he was telling her rather than waiting for him to finish. Then she said, in a tone that had not changed from professional but had acquired a quality of something underneath it, "I'm going to need to verify this independently." He said that was exactly right, and that he had expected her to say it, and that he would provide everything he had in whatever format was most useful to her process. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Atlas, who was sitting beside Ethan's chair with the composed alertness of a dog in a professional environment who has decided that his job right now is to be unobtrusive and is executing that decision with the precision he brought to everything. She said, "That's an unusual dog." Ethan said he was. She said, "Where'd you come from?" "Not the dog. You." Ethan said, "Most recently from Nashville by way of a lot of other places that weren't particularly relevant to the present situation." She almost smiled. Not quite. She was not a person who almost smiled carelessly. She said she would be in touch and that he should not do anything with the information he had before she had a chance to verify it, and that if what he was telling her was accurate, she wanted the process to go through proper channels so that nothing got thrown out on a technicality. He said he understood completely. He drove back up the mountain. The afternoon was clear, the storm had fully passed, leaving behind the specific stillness of a landscape that has been through something significant and is now resting in its aftermath, the sky a pale hard blue above the peaks, the light coming down at the low angle that January light uses in mountain country, everything sharp-edged and clean in a way that only happens after serious weather has finished its work. Ethan sat on the cabin step with his coffee and Atlas beside him, and the door opened behind him so he could hear the 7 dogs inside, and he counted the sounds, the small movements, the breathing, the occasional shift of position, and found all 7 accounted for. Soldier came to the door after a while and stood there, looking out at the clearing and the tree line and the particular place in the tree line where the kennel building was, which was not visible from this angle but which Soldier clearly knew the direction of. He stood there for several minutes. Then he came outside and sat beside Ethan on the step, not touching him, not demanding anything, simply present in the specific way of a dog who has decided that this is where he is supposed to be right now. His coat was cleaner today. Ethan had worked through it carefully that morning with the grooming tools he had brought for Atlas, and in the clean winter light he was, Ethan thought, a remarkable-looking animal. The build that spoke of function. The eyes that held everything they had seen without being destroyed by it. The notched ear that was simply one of his features, like any feature, like the scar on Ethan's own cheek. Atlas came and sat on Ethan's other side. The 3 of them sat on the cabin step in the January afternoon, and the mountain was quiet around them, and the light moved across the snow in the slow way that winter light moves, and nothing was said because nothing needed to be said. That evening Victor Crane came to the cabin. he did not come alone. He came with 2 men who drove a county vehicle, and who wore the expression of people who have been told to look official, and have concluded that looking official means looking large and saying nothing. Crane himself was in his winter coat, the expensive kind, and he had the particular bearing of someone who is accustomed to his presence in a space automatically conferring authority, the way a certain kind of institutional confidence arranges a person's posture without their necessarily being aware of it. He was 55, thin-faced, gray hair carefully maintained, and he had the eyes of a man who has spent a long career making decisions at a remove from their consequences, and has therefore developed a certain smoothness in the face that comes from never having had to look at the full weight of what those decisions produced. He stood in the clearing in front of the cabin, and said Ethan's name as if reading it from a document, which was how he said most things. Ethan was on the step. Atlas was beside him. Soldier was at the door behind them. Crane said that he understood there had been some confusion about the animals from the Holt facility, and that the county had been made aware that Ethan had removed them from county property, which technically constituted a violation of the administrative hold that had been placed on the facility, and that the county was prepared to be understanding about this given that it appeared to have been done with good intentions, but that the animals would need to be returned to county custody to be processed according to the established protocol. Ethan let him finish. Then he said, "What protocol would that be?" "The one documented in the follow-up files for the other 2 facility closures in the past 4 years? Something moved across Crane's face. Not much. The kind of movement that happens when a person's internal calculation encounters a number they weren't expecting. Ethan said, "Because I looked at those files this morning. The follow-up documentation for both of those closures is incomplete. Specifically, there is no documentation of what happened to the animals that were described as handled by the county. There are closure orders with your signature. There is no subsequent record of transfer to any licensed facility, any adoption program, any rescue organization, or any other outcome that the phrase handled by the county would normally imply." Crane said that administrative records were sometimes filed in different locations, and that the absence of documentation in one file did not indicate absence of action. Ethan said that was true, and that he had therefore also checked those other locations, and that the documentation was not there either, and that he had provided all of this to Deputy Sarah Mills that morning along with the property purchase inquiry and the holding company registration that connected Crane to the development group that had made an offer on Maggie Holt's land 14 months ago. The 2 men beside Crane had not moved. Crane had not moved. But the air in the clearing had changed in the way that air changes when the premise of a conversation has shifted and all parties are processing the new premise at different speeds. Atlas stood up. He did not growl. He did not take a step forward. He simply stood, which with a dog of his size and his particular quality of presence was itself a significant change in the composition of the scene. Soldier came to the doorway behind Ethan and stood there as well, and the 2 dogs together, the massive white shepherd and the Belgian Malinois mix with a notched ear, communicated something in the specific language of working dogs that required no translation. Crane said that he thought this conversation had moved into territory that would be better addressed through formal channels. Ethan said he agreed completely, and that fortunately he had initiated those formal channels that morning, and that Deputy Mills had indicated she would be following up with the relevant state oversight bodies given the cross-jurisdictional nature of the documentation he had provided. Crane left. The 2 men left with him. The county vehicle went back down the mountain road, and Ethan watched it go from the cabin step, and Atlas watched it go, and Soldier watched it go from the doorway, and then all 3 of them went back inside because the temperature was dropping and the 7 dogs needed checking and there was coffee to be made. Sarah Mills called at 9 that evening. She had been busy, she said, in a tone that suggested busy was a significant understatement. She had made 3 calls that afternoon, one to the State Attorney General's office, one to the State Animal Welfare Enforcement Division, and one to a colleague in the county adjacent to theirs who had mentioned, in passing, 6 months earlier, a similar pattern in a facility closure in her jurisdiction that she had found odd and never fully followed up on. She said that what had started as a call about a padlocked kennel had become something considerably larger than that in the course of a single afternoon, and that she wanted Ethan to know that he had apparently provided the thread that, when pulled, had begun unraveling something that had been sitting there waiting to be unraveled. She also said that Victor Crane had called the sheriff's office at 7:30 that evening and that the nature of that call had itself become relevant to the investigation. Ethan said he understood and that he would make himself available to whatever process needed him. She said, "I have to ask. What made you go out in that blizzard?" He said, "Atlas did." A pause. Then she said, "Right. The dog." He said yes. She said, "You know most people would have gone back to sleep." He said he knew. Another pause. Then she said, quietly, in a register that was not her official one, "Thank you. For not being most people." He said good night and hung up and sat for a while in the chair by the wood stove, and the 7 dogs breathed around him, and Atlas was at his left side, and Soldier was by the door but closer now, closer to the center of the room than he had been the previous night. A small but measurable shift in the direction of a dog who is beginning to believe that the door does not need to be watched quite as constantly as it did. The next 3 weeks moved in a way that Ethan would have difficulty describing afterward, if he were asked to describe them, which he wasn't particularly, because he was not the kind of person who sought out the opportunity to describe things. State investigators arrived on the 4th day following the blizzard night. 2 of them, professional and thorough in the way of people who have learned to be suspicious of what is not on the surface of documents and who have developed the skills to look beneath it. Ethan provided everything he had, which was organized in the way that someone with his training organizes information, which is to say clearly, completely, and with nothing that is not relevant included and nothing that is relevant excluded. The investigation expanded, as Sarah Mills had predicted, in the way that investigations expand when the thread they have found is connected to more than one thing: another jurisdiction, another set of facility closures, another series of properties that had experienced sudden administrative compliance issues and subsequent closures and subsequent purchase inquiries from development interests that turned out, on examination, to have connections to Victor Crane that had been constructed to be difficult to see but were not, in the end, impossible to see. Crane was suspended from his position on the 8th day. The suspension was administrative, which meant it was quiet, which meant most of the people in Coldwater Creek learned about it through the particular informal channel of information that small towns maintain for exactly this kind of news, conversation, implication, the language of things that are said between sentences rather than in them. Randy at the gas station said to Ethan, when Ethan came in for fuel on the 9th day, that he heard the county had some kind of issue up in the Land Services office, and that it sounded like it was probably serious. Ethan said he had heard something similar. Randy said, "Good." His expression, when he said it, was the expression of a man who has had a general feeling about someone for a long time and has just received confirmation that the general feeling was pointing in the right direction. Maggie Holt came to the cabin on the 6th day. Ethan had offered to bring the dogs to her. She had said no, she wanted to come to them, and the way she had said it told him that the coming was part of something she needed to do, not just a logistical preference, and so he had said of course and given her the road directions and made sure there was coffee. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon in an old Subaru that had seen the kind of service that mountain roads provide and had the marks to prove it, and she came up the path with the careful step of someone whose body has been carrying something heavy for days and has not fully adjusted to carrying it. She knocked on the cabin door. She knocked, which was a detail that Ethan noted, and he opened it and stepped aside and she came in. She stopped just inside the door. The 7 dogs were distributed around the cabin in the positions they had established over the previous 6 days, the small female shepherd mix on the braided rug that Atlas had conceded to her, the young male on the floor near the wood stove, the others at various points in a geography that had been worked out through the slow negotiations of animals sharing space and had settled into something that looked permanent. Atlas was in his usual position to the left of Ethan's chair, and Soldier was by the door, still near the door, still in his position, though closer to the room's center than he had been on day 1. Maggie Holt looked at all of them. She looked at each of them individually, the way you look at people you have not seen in a week and are afraid you might not see again, with a specific quality of attention that is actually a kind of counting, a confirming that the number you have been holding in your head matches the number you are seeing in front of you. Her lips moved. She was counting. When she reached 7, she put both hands over her mouth. She stood like that for a moment. Then she went to her knees on the cabin floor, not dramatically, not in the way of someone performing feeling, but in the way of someone whose legs have decided that standing is not appropriate for this moment. and the small female shepherd mix came to her immediately, with the direct, uncomplicated confidence of a dog who knows this person and has been waiting to see this person and is not interested in managing the emotion of the reunion, just the reunion itself. Maggie put her arms around the dog and held on, and the dog pressed against her, and Ethan went to the kitchen counter and stood with his back to the room and looked out the window at the clearing and the tree line and gave her the privacy the moment required. He heard, behind him, the movement of the other dogs going to her, one by one, in the unhurried way of animals who are not competing for anything but who are each doing their version of the same thing, which is making contact, confirming presence, communicating something in the language that requires no words. He heard Soldier's movement last. The particular gait of a dog whose left rear leg was still recovering, the slightly asymmetrical rhythm of it, and then the quiet that meant the dog had settled, and then Maggie's voice, very low, saying his name. Soldier. She said it again, the way you say the name of someone you were afraid you would not get to say again. Ethan turned around. Soldier had his head in her lap. His notched ear was turned toward her voice. His eyes were closed, and the expression on his face, if expression is the right word for what a dog's face does when the thing it has been waiting for has finally arrived, was the expression of something completed. Of a task that has been held in tension for days, finally being able to release. He had been standing over the others for 4 days, and he had stood between them and the door, and he had watched Ethan with a patient assessment of a creature that needed to be certain before it trusted, and now he had his head in Maggie Holt's lap, and his eyes were closed, and the standing was over because the person who made the standing make sense had come back. Ethan sat in his chair. Atlas put his chin on Ethan's knee. Outside the window the January afternoon was doing what January afternoons in Montana do, which is moving toward its early end with the unhurried efficiency of something that has a schedule and keeps to it regardless of whether you are done with the day. Maggie looked up at him after a while. Her face was a complicated document, grief and relief and gratitude and something that was working its way toward something it didn't have a name for yet. She said, "How did you know to go out?" He said, "I didn't. Atlas did." She looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back at her with the calm amber of his eyes that were always doing the same thing, which was paying complete attention. She said, "I don't know how to thank you." He said, "The dogs are here. That's enough." She shook her head slightly, in the way of someone who disagrees but has decided not to argue it. Then she looked at Soldier, who had not moved from her lap, and she stroked the notched ear slowly, and she said, "He never left them. 4 days. I keep thinking about that." Ethan said he kept thinking about it too. She said, "What do you do with that? With knowing that?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You try to be worth it. The standing. You try to be worth what it cost him." Maggie looked at him with her kind tired green eyes, and she nodded once, slowly, in the way of a person acknowledging something that is both painful and true, and then she looked back at Soldier and was quiet. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't make sense as weeks. They accumulated in the way that weeks accumulate when you are inside something that is moving and you are too close to it to see its shape. The investigation moved. Crane was formally charged on the 19th day, not just for what had happened with Maggie's facility but for the pattern that had been established across the 3 jurisdictions, a pattern that added up to something that the Attorney General's office described as a systematic abuse of administrative authority for personal financial gain, which was the official language for what Ethan would have described in shorter words. The charges were enough. The process was slow, as these processes are, but it was moving, and Sarah Mills called Ethan every few days with updates that told him the moving was real and not the performed version of moving that sometimes substitutes for it. Maggie got her land back. Not immediately. There were administrative steps, documents, the careful reversal of what administrative power had put in place, but she got it back, and on the day the county formally restored her facility's operating status she drove up to Ethan's cabin and knocked on the door with a bottle of something that was not expensive but was chosen with care and said, "I want to rebuild. I want to open again. And I can't do it alone." Ethan said, "What do you need?" She said, "Help. Physically. The building needs work. And someone who knows how to read a dog." He said, "I can do that." It took 6 weeks. Ethan had the skills, the construction skills of someone who has built things in difficult conditions with limited resources, which translate very directly to the skills required for rebuilding a kennel facility in Montana in January. And he had Atlas, who was invaluable not for any construction-related ability but for the contribution he made to the 7 dogs' recovery during the period when Ethan was working at the facility and they were spending time there in the company of both dogs, Atlas and Soldier, and the working partnership of those 2 animals was something that Ethan watched from the corner of his eye when he thought he had a spare moment, which was not often, and what he saw was not what he expected. He had expected, given Soldier's history and his protective orientation, some version of territorial friction. He had expected the negotiation that working dogs sometimes engage in when they are establishing hierarchy. He had expected at least the period of careful assessment that precedes a stable coexistence. He did not get any of those things. What he got instead was something he did not have a ready framework for. 2 dogs who had clearly arrived at an understanding on the first night, in the cabin, when Ethan had not been watching, and who were now operating within that understanding with the effortless coordination of partners who have worked out who does what and have found the arrangement satisfactory. Atlas ranged and assessed and communicated information. Soldier held position and monitored and was the anchor to which the others oriented when they needed an anchor. Between them they covered the function that either one alone could not have covered as completely, and the 7 recovering dogs moved through the facility space with a security that had a quality Ethan recognized, the security of animals who know that the perimeter is watched and that the watchers are competent. He watched them one afternoon in the 2nd week of the rebuild, the 2 dogs sitting together at the east wall of the facility, looking out across the cleared ground toward the tree line, both of them still, both of them present in the complete way of working animals doing what they are built to do. And he thought about the night he had followed Atlas into the blizzard, and about the padlocked door, and about Soldier standing over the others in the dark, and about the particular kind of courage that does not know it is courage because it is simply the only available response to the situation, the kind that does not calculate because calculation is not the point, the kind that plants itself in the frozen ground and says not yet, not while I still breathe, not while there is still something between me and the end of what I was put here to do. He thought about 16 years of service and about the things that service had cost and the things it had given him, and about the man he had been before the vehicle and the road and the country he could not name, and about whether that man and this man were the same man or different men or something in between. Some version that was being worked out in a cabin in Montana with 8 dogs and a community that was learning to trust a stranger and a stranger who was learning what it felt like to be trusted. He thought about Maggie Holt's question, "What do you do with that?" with knowing that Soldier stood for 4 days, and about his own answer, which had been true when he said it and was still true now and was maybe the truest thing he had said in a long time. You try to be worth it. The facility opened on a Thursday in the middle of February, on a clear cold day when the light came down through the pines in the particular way it comes in late winter, slightly warmer than January, slightly longer in the afternoon, carrying somewhere in it the barely perceptible suggestion of a season that does not yet exist but is thinking about beginning to. There was no ceremony. Maggie was not a ceremony person and neither was Ethan, but there were people. Patricia from the diner brought coffee in a large thermos. Randy from the gas station came with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who is not sure he deserves to be there but has decided to come anyway. Sarah Mills came in her deputy's jacket and helped carry the last of the equipment from Ethan's truck. And above the door of the rebuilt facility, on a sign that Pete Harlow had made in his woodshop from a piece of white oak that he had been saving for something and had decided this was it, in clean routed letters that would last through many winters, Coldwater Creek Rescue. And below that, smaller, in memory of the ones who were left in silence. And below that, smaller still, they were not alone. Ethan stood in front of it for a moment. Atlas was at his left side. Soldier was at his right. Not because Ethan had placed him there, not because of any command or arrangement, but because that was where Soldier had decided to be, and Soldier's decisions about where to be had a quality of finality that Ethan had learned to trust. Maggie came and stood beside them and looked at the sign and then looked at Ethan and said, "I keep thinking about what you told me. About trying to be worth it. And I think the trying is the thing. I think the trying is what he was doing, those 4 days. Just trying. Just not stopping." Ethan looked at the sign. Then he looked at Soldier. Soldier was looking at the tree line, which was what Soldier did. He watched the perimeter, even now, even here, even in a moment that was not operational, because watching the perimeter was simply who he was and there was no reason to be otherwise. The notched ear turned slightly, in the direction of Ethan's gaze. Ethan said, "Yeah, I think so too." He did not say anything else, because the moment did not require anything else, and he had spent enough time in places where silence was information to understand when it was being given. He went to get the last crate from the truck. Atlas went with him. Soldier watched the tree line, and the mountains stood above Coldwater Creek the way they had always stood, enormous and patient and entirely unchanged by what had happened at their feet, which was not a commentary on what had happened. Mountains do not make commentaries, but simply the fact of what mountains are, which is old enough and large enough and permanent enough that the things that happen in their shadow, however significant, are held within them the way all significant things are held within the landscape of the world, present, real, capable of mattering completely to the people inside them, and at the same time held by something larger that does not require them to be explained. 3 weeks later, on the first clear warm Saturday in March that Coldwater Creek had experienced since October, Ethan drove down the mountain with Atlas in the passenger seat and Soldier in the back, and he stopped at the gas station for fuel, and Randy came out to the pump and looked at Soldier and said, "Is that one of Maggie's?" Ethan said, "He was. He's mine now." Randy looked at the dog for a long moment. Soldier looked back at him with the steady, complete attention that Soldier gave everything. The notched ear was forward, reading whatever there was to read in the air and the situation and the person standing at the pump. Randy said, "Good." Then he started the pump and went back inside, because that was enough, and sometimes enough is exactly the right amount. Ethan drove up the mountain. The road was clear. The snow pulled back from the edges in the way snow pulls back in March when it has begun to understand that the argument is going to be decided against it eventually. The sky was blue above the peaks, the real blue, the blue that comes back after winter has finished, and the light was doing the thing it does in early spring in mountain country, where it has recovered enough angle to actually warm the surfaces it touches, and everything that had been frozen and still was beginning, very slowly, to consider the possibility of otherwise. Atlas had his nose at the cracked window. Soldier was looking at the road ahead, his great head raised, his notched ear turned slightly into the wind. Ethan drove and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and the mountain was there the way it was always there, and the cabin was waiting the way good places wait, without urgency, without condition, simply present, and somewhere below them Coldwater Creek was doing what it had always done, which was continuing, which is what places do, which is enough. It is always enough.